Welcome to today's Apcu Forum. I am Jeffrey Na, President and Moderator this afternoon. And we would like to start by calling on our Vice Chairman, Mr. Sixto Benedicto, to give the invocation.
Good afternoon, a pleasant to everyone. I am requesting all of us to put ourselves in the spirit of prayer. It is with glad hearts that we come to you, our God, to hold the 8th Apcu Zoom Forum. We come to you on this afternoon to give thanks for the limitless occasions, to appreciate life and to bring to accomplishment our mission as individuals and as members of an organization as instruments of promoting diplomacy, information, and advancement, and an institution which serves as a way for new purpose and initiatives, even amid an unideal circumstance brought by the pandemic through online forums. Support all our projects, be it for ourselves and most especially for Apcu as we promote its activities, aims, and objectives. Most importantly, today's forum. Guide the speaker that she may share the most of her knowledge to her respective topic. May those who will be sharing knowledge give us relevant points so we all put it into practice what we may learn today. Help us to participate in meaningful discussion that we may take part and be willing to make this a productive and insightful forum. Give us lucidity on our purpose for this forum and what intentions we should achieve. May these intentions keep us on right path and may they connect us collectively with a common purpose. Assist us not to get disturbed by things within our own places. Educate our minds in every word that will hear, even if we have different opinions. Unite us. Help us to listen respectfully as others share their points of view. We ask you for wisdom and prudence for the awesome privilege to steward good outputs. Favor our discussions, plans, programs, and projects so that we may achieve our objectives. All this we ask to you, our dear Lord. Amen. In the name of Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Take it away, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. And now, to give their welcoming remarks, we would like to call on Apcu Chairman and Secretary Raul Lambino.
Thank you, President Jeff, and the members of the board of Apcu, as well as the members of Apcu all over the world and the guests who are present in today's Zoom meeting. Good afternoon. On behalf of the Association for Philippines-China Understanding, or Apcu, I welcome our participants in today's virtual forum on one of the great issues facing our country and its impact and ramifications. We are honored to welcome our esteemed resource speaker who has agreed to grace our forum today, and she's none other than Dr. Tina Clemente of the University of the Philippines. Welcome, Dr. Clemente. Not too long ago, a leader of one of the ASEAN member states said, when he was asked about the Belt and Road Initiative, that China's massive infrastructure program that has been touted as globe-changing, some even seeing it as unparalleled in scope and also in ambition, replied, and I quote, "Other countries have lots of ideas, but no money. But for China, when it comes with an idea, it also comes with money." While it is a sentiment that has been echoed in other countries or regions of the Asian continent, notably in Ulrich's Central Asia, the geographical heartland of the ancient and original Chinese Silk Roads, through which once flowed a commerce of goods as well as ideas between Asia and Europe. One leader in Kazakhstan thinks that China compares favorably with the West while declaring that China, and I quote, does not dictate terms, does not demand the adoption of foreign values, and is a much more attractive partner, unquote. We will know from our guest speaker today if there are strong bases for making such bold declarations. But indeed, the Belt and Road Initiative, which was originally conceived as the One Belt, One Road, has caught the imagination and big fire, and has even brought some countries, more particularly the West, their apprehension of what does China want to achieve in the next decade or so. In our vibrant corner of the world, situated in the sea of such strategic centrality to 21st century trade and security, that is now a zone of dispute, China has emerged in the century as a major competitor to the Philippines' biggest source for years of official development assistance, which is Japan. As one expert has pointedly said, the BIR or BRI is currently heavily invested in infrastructure, making it an attractive proposition for the Philippine government. During the last quarter of 2018, only one project was funded by the Chinese ODA compared to Japan, with 10 grant-funded projects in the country worth $141.33 million and 22 official development assistance loan-funded projects amounting to over $6 billion, according to a DEVEX analysis of ODA loans and grants from the National Economic Development Authority. It is interesting to note, though, that in the list of pipeline ODA projects pending approval for endorsement in the NEDA, the database that year, were 19 projects that would be financed with Chinese ODA loans worth close to 14 billion US dollars. Not infrequently, some experts have told the alarm bells and warned the Philippines against too much reliance on Chinese-funded assistance, citing Sri Lanka's huge debt over Chinese-funded infrastructure as a cautionary tale. In 2017, Sri Lanka had to hand over control of its Hambantota port to China for 99 years after failing to renegotiate payments for the project. Historically, for Japan, it sees the sustainable development of the Philippines as important, not only as a base of its economic activity, but also geopolitically as a contributor to the stability and development of the East Asia region. Japan considers the development of the Philippine infrastructure, especially in transportation, as essential, and equally the improvement of its investment environment to promote foreign direct investments. The 25.3-kilometer Metro Manila subway, for which Japan, as a development partner, has loaned 50 billion pesos, is one such project that seemed a dream too far, not too long ago, but is just now about to take off. It is a fact that Japan and the Philippines share fundamental values, such as democracy, rule of law, human rights, and the market economy. Amid these cross currents of the 21st century, what impression and new images can we discern as they relate to Philippine development and the transformation of the region? What is in store for us in the future in terms of aid and investments being extended by Japan and China? What should we watch out for or be wary about? Are there implications that we have refused to see or have remained blind to? Ladies and gentlemen, We are in for a lively and enlightening discussion today with our resource person. So again, a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Raul. And now to introduce our guest speaker, we will call on Apcu Vice President, Mr. Felix Guanzon. VP Felix.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This task of introducing our guest of honor and speaker is a great privilege. She is a woman of virtue and simplicity. I feel happy to introduce her to everyone. Our guest of honor and speaker today is the living idiom of a woman with an impressive background. Tina Saavedra Clemente is a professor at the Asian Center University of the Philippines, Diliman. He teaches graduate courses in both the Asian Studies and Philippine Studies program of the center. He earned a PhD and MA in economics as well as a BS in business economics at the School of Economics, UP Diliman. Their research interests are Northeast Asia studies, Philippine-China economic relation, economic history, and Philippine development. He was awarded the 1UP Professional Chair in ASEAN Studies for Teaching and Research 2019-2021. He also lectured at the Development Academy of the Philippines on economic application for the public sector. Professor Clemente is a former president of the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies and at present is an active board member. Currently, Professor Clemente is the editor-in-chief of the Chinese Studies Journal. She was a senior editor of Asia Politics and Policy, associate editor of Social Science Diliman, and issue lead editor of the ASEAN Studies Journal, Journal of Critical Perspective on Asia. Their edited volume include Perspective on China and the Chinese through the years, a retrospective collection 1992 to 2013, and China Studies in the Philippines, Intellectual Paths and Formation of a Field. He also headed the 2016 China Strategic Studies Program of the UP Center for Integrative Development Study. Recently, she was appointed as member of the UP Diliman Task Force on a blueprint for building the nation. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome our guest speaker, Professor Saavedra Clemente.
Okay. Dr. Tina.
All right. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. Okay. Sorry, it's taking long because the file is so heavy. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. I am honored to be with you today. Let me first thank President Jeffrey Nang for inviting me. Okay, as you see, the title of my presentation is Comparing Perceptions and Empirics, China and Japan, Aid and Investment in the Philippines. So let me start with a very brief introduction. When President Duterte assumed office in 2016, his trips to China and the resulting bilateral economic agreements attracted significant attention. It signaled a warming of relations and a strengthening of economic cooperation. However, the president also traveled to Japan with bilateral talks resulting in important economic agreements as well. On the other hand, the state visits to the Philippines from China and Japan were also telling about how these countries were repositioning themselves with the Philippines and with each other, reflecting a larger geo-economic picture in the region. This presentation is based on preliminary results of research that I'm doing with Alan Villota, a PhD candidate at the University of Tokyo. The research analyzes the economic relationship of these countries with the Philippines by juxtaposing academic discourse, I got lost. Yeah, academic discourse, perceptions, and empirical data on aid and investment. But for our purposes this afternoon, since I have limited time, I will just be focusing on certain aspects of perceptions and empirics, i.e. how sentiment and media frames converge and diverge with empirical data. The work underscores how narratives affect the appreciation of economic cooperation, and hopefully I'll be able to end with some useful insights on further research. Okay. So I have only two parts in my presentation, so I'll have this first part out of the way before I go into the meat in a little while. So many scholars have done a lot already. They've done a lot of work on how perceptions affect foreign relations. So I'll mention just a few here today. For instance, Gallardo and Bavera in 2013 interrogate views in the Philippines from 2011 to 2012 regarding the Philippines-China disputes on the Reed Bank and Scarborough Shoal. Perspectives on government foreign policy, the response of different actors, and views on China and the US were analyzed in polls and opinions in media. Montiel and others in 2014 explore Philippine and China media content on the Scarborough Shoal conflict and use both quantitative and qualitative analyses of the use of text. The study associates nationalistic views with linguistic construction. So it paints a picture of how media can be a force in producing certain narratives. In a preliminary assessment of reportage in 2020, my colleague at PAX, Lucio Pitlo, analyzed reports in Philippine news on China. So the notions of threat, risk, and opportunity were the most prominent frames on China. In topics such as the pandemic and economic recovery, infrastructure, trade and economy, and even POGOs, and immigration, and even joint development. He observed the dichotomy between economic security, the dichotomy between economic and security perceptions, with security getting more attention. Earlier, in 2016, in fact, I did a study and analyzed economic diplomacy between the Philippines and China by scrutinizing the pattern of bilateral memoranda of understanding in the represented sectors. No? The study was not on media and perceptions per se, but the empirical approach contributed to contextualizing negative or positive impressions on China's position in economic cooperation, drawing nuance into viewing China's place as a Philippine economic partner. Okay, so in this study, what we want to do is simply to interrogate the disconnect between perceptions and empirical reality. So in this section on sentiment, I'll be looking at reportage. So let me just show you a very simple figure, two figures actually. So this slide shows you our cursory analysis on the occurrence of words, and I think it's quite difficult to look at it here because I tried to put two pictures in one slide, and so I think the scale is affected. But basically, you will notice upon closer inspection, no, that certain words are magnified in China, certain words are magnified in Japan, and then there are certain words that are less magnified in one and as well as the other. No, so okay, so here's what we did. So we used the Factiva database, and we worked with nearly 500 articles from the following dailies: Business World, Manila Times, Manila Bulletin, Philippine Star, and Philippine Daily Inquirer. So the visualization that you see is looks at the frequency of certain words. So for China, the bigger words, For China, the bigger words are investments, infrastructure, government, million, and agreement. For Japan, the bigger words are development, investments, loans, billion, and economic. So this is just very useful to look at first impressions. No, we will see later if the narratives and the empirical data actually coincide. But from first impression, you could already see that these are what we usually encounter. If you talk to people, you read the news, the certain impressions are made, and basically it's consistent. So, but due to some reservations when it comes to programming sentiment, we've encountered concerns with such things as synonymy, polysemy, compound sentences, sarcasm, and multiple contexts of sentiment in a text. We decided to base our in-depth study on a close reading and content analysis of a smaller sample, which is 146 articles, all online content from the same dailies mentioned earlier, plus a news blog, which is Raptor. So we added that into the corpus of the smaller data set. So these make up the non-exhaustive corpus of new articles that tackle FDI and ODA from China and Japan to the Philippines for the period 2016 to 2020. Okay. Okay. So this is what we were able to generate in terms of the general sentiment. No. So you will see China on one side, Japan on the other. And in China's case, majority of the new articles conveyed a negative tone. So you see there the details in parentheses. So that's the summary. No. So China has 54.3% negative sentiment, and then 26.58% you have that for the positive tone, and the rest of the articles had a neutral tone at 18.9, practically 19%. For Japan, in Japan's case, the tone of the articles was predominantly positive with 88% and a few times neutral at 10%. The graphs that you see here look at frequency per year. We wanted to break it down per year from 2016 to 2020, and you'll see that it's actually observable that Japan only had positive and neutral tones in the reports, with the former increasing yearly and outnumbering the latter substantially. No? So you see that positive reportage also increased in the last 2 years. So that's for Japan. China had negative reportage in all the years. So you also see that it increased in 2019. Okay. Hold on. Okay. So from looking at sentiment or tone, we wanted to know how these translated into the nature of reportage. No? So I now present stylized categories or media frames, no, as I call it, used in the articles to compare China and Japan. So I only have limited time, so I'll just be presenting a few excerpts, no, of the articles that we worked on. All throughout the discussion, I'll be interspersing data processed from the articles, from our content analysis, and data processed from official government data. Okay. So basically, in the following slides, you will see 3 stylized categories of media frame. So the first, I call it conflated issues. Okay. So where various other issues with China unrelated to its economic contribution to the Philippines are mentioned. And on the other hand, the Japanese economic contribution is mentioned also in comparison. The second category that we will be looking at is, I call it reckoning expectations, where the actual, okay, hold on. Sorry. Reckoning expectations, where the actual predicament of economic cooperation is lamented vis-a-vis the desired outcome. So expectations are being compared to what actually happened. So the third category that we'll be looking at would be project details. No? So where a Chinese project is found lacking and a Japanese project is described in contrast. Okay, so let me now go to the first category. So mind you, this is just stylized categories based on how we content analyze the articles and how we closely read them. Okay, so these are excerpts. No, I put the source there so you could easily check it out. right away, like real time, like right now. You will notice that it's not the whole article. No? So we just, it's quite long. So we just chose certain parts. So you will see here all sorts of negative, uh, all sorts of negative impressions. No, or the article demonstrates several negative perceptions on China strung together. The cornucopia of negative perceptions show how various frames of China are easily related to each other as characteristics of the same whole, while being contrasted with the positive quality of Japan. So in articles like this, the units of analysis are actually not comparable. No? So of course, when there are excesses from economic relationship, we deal with it according to Philippine interests. And this applies to all partners, no? China, Japan, US, EU. No? But what about the good things? Shouldn't we encourage and capitalize on those? So if we start an argument with the phrase, nothing good comes out of this engagement, then we miss out on fruitful aspects. No? So right now, one of our biggest problems is that when issues are conflated, it produces a very convoluted picture, no? Such that even in things that are trivial, you see this manifesting, di ba? So just recently, I saw a forwarded message, and pati Lunar New Year, wag nang ipagdiwang kasi China daw, no? So it becomes very problematic because it when we keep conflating, it can have a life of its own. Okay, so conflation can occur in this sense, no, where all negative things are said in one breath, right? And then in the middle of that, you insert Japan and only about its economic contribution, right? But on the other hand, conflating issues can also go the other way, where you say that, oh, everything is good. And so all the other things that people raise as issues are trivialized. So what we're saying is that conflation in any sense, no, can be a problem because perceptions feed into relations. Okay, in the bigger picture. Okay, the second category that we looked at, yes, is reckoning expectations. Now, so here you'll find some excerpts, and then I also put down the source there. So in the Philippines, you'll see that in the beginning of the warming of relations, there were so many reports that came out, no, saying that these were the agreements and that. Okay, but here you find certain descriptions. You find a lackluster flow of financial support for the infrastructure program. And then you also find a mention of the lack of enthusiasm on the part of Chinese government to prioritize Philippine projects. So, and then in the middle of it, you find insertions of Japan as a comparison, right? Okay, so basically what the category says, no, from our observation is that the expectations were not managed, no? Because we always set the beginning as the benchmark. And what was the beginning? It was all rosy, and it was so there was no discussion even about the real institutional picture and what constraints may be found in the economic environment, such that actualizing the agreements would be difficult. So yeah. So that is a concern, no? So in the next slides, I'll be showing a bunch of data. Okay, so forgive me for that because it's quite data heavy, right? Okay, so let's look at that. Hold on. Let me back up. Oops. Okay, so before I go to the next slide, no. So in the Philippines, the inability to attract FDI has always underscored weakness, no, in policies, domestic conditions, and economic diplomacy. So this is actually the conversation that we're missing when we just simply pit what was said before and what actually happened. No? So, for instance, there's an interesting study by Montes and Cruz just last year, and it unpacked the issues on the suitability between FDI flows and the Philippine context and how it's upgrading its industries. So, in other words, the issue of appropriateness and fit underscore how important alignment is, no, in government strategies. So, and then you throw in political economy into the picture, and so now it becomes very difficult. So I'll get back to this later in the section on reflections, but I just wanted to register this, no, because when we think about expectations, it also applies to our other partnerships. No? Like there's this long-standing criticism that the Philippines is lagging behind in everything, FDI and the aid. And so whenever we enter into an agreement, like for instance, an economic partnership with our neighbors in ASEAN, the Philippines lags behind, and the 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 main critique is the institutional capability, facilitation, the institutional environment, and institutional health, no, in general, and how we manage agreements. Okay, so these are some of the data, the data that we process. So in this particular slide, we analyze the content of the articles and we observe the types of infrastructure projects of China and Japan, no, as mentioned. So let me just reiterate that this is data culled from the article. So in terms of how things are reported, this is the picture that we see, right? For Japan, well, Japan is indicated by blue color and then red for China. So you'll see here that Japan has dominated the mention of airports, roads, and railways. On the other hand, China accounts for most of the mention of bridge and dam projects. Okay, but how do we square this off? How do we square all our impressions, no, with what we find in government data? So let me go there. So in this slide and the next slides, I'll be showing you ODA data and FDI data. So the raw data can be found in government documents. That's easily accessible even to you. But for this research, we did our own processing. So here in this particular slide, no, you'll see that countries are ranked according to the total contribution. So we just wanted to see that, no, because fluctuations can happen every year. So we reckoned it according to the total in the 4 years. No? So you see here that Japan is ranked first and China is in the bottom part. However, in 2019, China improved its position and it's now fifth. Okay, so you will see here in the 2019 bars, right? You see that China is the blue bar, fourth from the last. And so that's a big jump from before. Okay. Okay. So in terms of total ODA broken down into loan and grant amounts, no. So this is in terms of US dollars amounts. So you'll see here, okay, Japan is indicated by blue, China orange, no. And so you'll see here that in 2019, Japan had about 8.5 billion USD. And then China, about 590 million. So if you try to recall what we saw on the word cloud figures, right? It actually matches. So, but it's just simply saying that the discrepancy is quite wide, you know, except that China's been improving over the years. Okay, now this is just the utilization rate and amount, no, pertaining to grants. No? So I included this because of the expectations, no, that we had it was approved, it was promised and it was approved, but where is it? So you'll see here in 2019, in terms of the grant amount and utilization, so same period, 2016 to 2019, Japan accounts for more grants than China. So obviously, it doesn't take rocket science to see that. But in 2018, China started catching up until it greatly exceeded Japan's amount. So just look at 2019, you'll see there the grant amount bar. No? So China has 97.27, Japan has 51.91, okay, in terms of grant amount. However, the utilization rate, that's the thing. You only have 5% for China. Okay, so compare this to the 2016 figure below. Do you see that? So the situation is a little bit reversed. You see here that in terms of the grant amount, China has 1.56, as you see there, but its utilization is higher. Now, so you have a mix of factors here. No? You have, on one hand, we need to unpack later on, or we need to reflect later on, what's impeding the actualization or the use. No? What is stumping the use of these resources when they've already come in. And so, but another factor would also be that it actually came in, but there are reasons why it's not utilized, no, and all that. So it makes us reflect on that. What are the conditions in the institutional environment, right? Because we don't hear much of that, no, in any conversation. Okay. Okay. So this is So this is approved foreign investments by investor country, and so we processed data on this for the same period and ranked investor countries according to their total approved investments in the period. So mind you, it's approved. No? So it's approved investments. In the technical definition, you can find it in the document, but it's basically that approved foreign investments represent investment commitments and pledges by foreigners, which may be realized in the future. Excuse me. While on the other hand, FDI refers to actual foreign investments. This slide and the next one. So you'll see here that China is actually second, right? So the brown bar refers to the 4-year total. So you'll see that if you take into consideration the approved and foreign investments in 4 years, China significantly improved its position. Do you see? So Singapore is here on top. Okay. So we found that China's commitments and pledges of foreign investment in the Philippines have substantially improved from the lowest figures among the ranked countries, such that its ranking is now second to Singapore. The increase is actually attributed to figures in 2 quarters, no? About 48 billion pesos in the fourth quarter of 2018 and 86.3 billion in the fourth quarter of 2019. So these spikes explain why China's share in total approved foreign investment from more than 20 investor countries improved a lot over the years. No, in 2019 it exceeded Japan's share. Okay, so it's a clear departure from China's historically low share in total approved foreign investment. But the thing is, however, we emphasize that FDI remains the better indicator in regard to development goals. So now maybe my students would be confused, because what was that previous slide all about? That was also about investments, and why are we talking about FDI now? Those are 2 different indicators, right? They both speak about investments, and actually every time there's data on the approved investments, it's always reported, right? You'll see a press release, or it's said in a press con, right? So it's reported, no? But it can be confusing for the public, because when these figures are just said like that, no, it's very difficult to map out the whole picture. So approved investments are just those that refer to what was what we said yes to, right? But whether it was actualized, well, that's another story. Now, whether it was realized, that's another story. So here you find the actual flows, no, and you'll see here that Japan is first and China's last, right? Okay, so now it allows us to think back and to reflect on the category, right? Unrealized expectations, or you have expectations here, and then okay, it didn't happen, and so it does generate this kind of thing. But mind you, we're only doing this where we only have this particular impression because it's China, right? You don't hear anything said about unrealized expectations with other partners, even if there are actually issues, because it doesn't take rocket science to know that when you have an economic partnership with any partner, there will always be issues. So the narrative, the negative narrative, is into this a lot. Okay. So all right. This one, okay, I think this is the most confusing graph ever, because I tried to cram all information in this one graph. Okay, so you have Japan and China FDI and percent share in total FDI from 2005 to 2019. So I wanted to see the larger view. Recall, this particular slide just gives you a picture of where China is among the partners, right? But here in this slide, we're just comparing the 2 countries, but we wanted a longer view for observation. Okay, so what does the figure tell us? The figure compares the historical trend of both countries' FDI from 2005 to 19, and it is observable that Japan's FDI has always exceeded that of China, except in 2018. So the percent share of both countries' FDI in total FDI from all investors show a similar pattern, where Japan's share has always exceeded China's. In general, despite dips in some years, Japan's percent share in total FDI has been substantially more than China's. So, Okay, so the question is, do these distinctions matter? While reportage on investment is not intended to provide an overarching picture to the public, what these figures affirm is that there's a dichotomy between what this figure and the other figures as well, no? Those that came before this. No? What they show is that there is indeed a dichotomy between China's commitment and actualized economic participation, no? As echoed in the articles, as well as Japan's historical and current position as an economic power. Okay, now, the third category, let me go into that. So the first category was about issues that tend to be conflated and therefore tends to muddle the picture, right? The second category is about expectations, how expectations were managed. No? And then, so this third category describes articles that actually talk about the details of the project. No? Okay, so here you find a description of China's 73-meter high dam, right? And then all the critiques about that, right? And then it is contrasted with another project by Japan. Okay, so articles also so what does this say? And articles that are similar to this, no? So they actually provide the public with details, but it brings with them the affective tones that we observed earlier, right? So if you look at it, isn't this just about details, right? We can look at it objectively, but unfortunately, the media frames and the sentiment actually manifest in the tones, no? And always in these articles, Japan is always pitted against China as the better comparison. And okay, the problem with this is that if this is the only information we have, right, and the public's not getting other things, it's very difficult to contextualize the big picture. That maybe perhaps in these comparisons, we are comparing apples to oranges. Okay. Now, let me give you an idea about how reportage mentions, no, the projects from China and Japan. So you see here infrastructure projects of both countries, and I'll start with China first. No? You'll see here about 66 projects mentioned, no, in the articles. So Chico River and Kaliwa Dam are in bold font here because I wanted to emphasize that the reality is that while the mentioned projects are almost the same in number, the Chinese projects are the ones associated with controversy. So this is the one for Japan. The tally is about 71, right? So from the side of the public, you see here, more or less, they won't be able to commit everything to memory, right? It's impossible. Who does that? Okay, that's the thing. Like these things are mentioned, but from the vantage point of the larger public, what really captures their imagination is controversy. So that's why you have that here. Okay, so what else were we able to find? So also in the articles, we observed that what also helped Japan's positioning in the public's perception is that its aid, as reported, is diversified throughout different sectors, not just in infrastructure, such as community development, pandemic response, agriculture and agrarian reform, peace building, education, disaster risk reduction. Dami, di ba? The figure shows the distribution of ODA types, across these, and it gives the impression that Japan is sincere in holistic development initiatives. So again, you try to recall the word cloud, and you'll see here that Japan had a bigger word for development there, right? Okay. So this table shows you the non-infrastructure aid projects, per country. And true enough, it just confirms what we earlier said. So you'd have more mentions of Japan's community development projects, none for China. And then you have Japan here as well for disaster risk reduction projects, and just one for China. So let me just remind you again that these are from content analyzed articles. No? So meaning it's contingent on how it's mentioned, right? And the frequency of its mention. Okay, all right. This is the continuation. So other projects aside from community development and DRR would be here. Maritime Safety Capability Improvement Project, the master plan for Subic, and others. China also has two mentions here, a coastal development program and a smart city project. Okay, so NEDA actually came up with what's called result matrices. So what are these? These were generated by NEDA regarding the outcome of ODA projects with all development partners and how the results are in line with Philippine development goals. No? So it's just part of monitoring. No? So you'll see that in government documents. So we find that China was only mentioned once and only in relation to the first sector. Japan is mentioned profusely in all. Okay, which again confirms what we said earlier about the impression being that Japan is in many different sectors, no, that promote development. Okay, so from all that data, I'm looking at three major reflections. So the first is the need for more information in data. Usually, you'd have data on trade that you can just look up easily and download and process yourself. But there are just so many things that researchers don't have. No? So, wait. So for instance, okay, if we don't have adequate data and information available to the public and researchers, we get to miss out on balancing the picture. So remember the first category, which was on conflation, no? And that's very troubling because, for instance, there's a study on China's FDI and how it positively affects capital accumulation and growth in productivity and employment in developing countries. There's also another study that tackles how Chinese FDI positively affects the green total factor productivity of BRI countries, right? But we won't be able to get into these studies if our mindset is that there's nothing good that can come out of the relationship, right? Okay. Where ODA is concerned, Chinese ODA has actually been evolving. So what is observed in both FDA and ODA regimes of China is that the institutional health of the partner country is critical in shaping the nature of these effects. So the point is, if our experience is different, we need to ask why so that proper interventions can be in order. But we cannot get to this if we want to write off the entire relationship, saying that wala eh, vassal or ganon, no? So just to set things, just to be clear about it, like I said in the beginning, when we were in that section, no, we have Philippine interests. So let's go for that. That's our priority, right? However, when there are excesses, and rather if there are excesses, then we try to address that. But there are just so many things that we can explore and we can actually encourage. So the studies that I just mentioned are actually very important because they're underexplored, no? Or because they're saying, oh, there's a huge disconnect between those studies and what's being experienced by few countries, including the Philippines. But the major reflection that I was able to glean from those studies is that well, both China and Japan investment and aid regimes are evolving, right? But since China is the new player and it's an emerging player in these indicators, what we see is that they're also managing, right? Or managing the nature of their cooperation depending on the institutional environments of partner countries. So this particular insight applies to all three reflections that I listed there. So we need more information and data to see the picture, and then we need a more deliberate effort for transparency, especially in our situation where tensions can magnify certain issues. Transparency is very important. You don't want people to keep speculating, and speculating breeds conflating, right? Breeds conflation. And then the third point that I wanted to leave with you is the institutional picture. Let's go back. Yes. So the institutional picture is so important because for a long time I've been interested in this particular aspect of relations, because usually we just talk about geopolitical things and what different actors can do. But if we look at the institutional health, no, of the Philippines, it will actually give us a better understanding why we're actually lagging behind in our economic partnerships. And this applies to our partnerships with ASEAN. Recently, we had RCEP, right? And other future partnerships that we might get into. No, that is a very long-standing critique about the Philippines, and we need to strive to improve things there. No, in terms of facilitation cost, the whole transactions costs, no, that actually occur when we're trying to implement certain projects. No, so you have a very huge institutional concern there. Okay, I think I said too much already, and perhaps I'll stop here, and then we can continue the conversation as you ask and as I answer. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Tina. For the information of everyone, we welcome your questions in the chat room. No? Just type in your chat, and I will try my best to ask your questions to Dr. Tina. We have some preliminary questions already, and well, we were quite struck, no, by the number of negative views on and comments on newspaper reports, no, on China and Japanese aid and investments. In the case of China, more than 50% are negative. In the case of Japan, there's almost zero negative views. No, vast majority are positive, if not neutral. To what do you count, no, for such imbalanced views, especially towards the negative views for China?
Right. Okay. Thank you for the question. The maritime dispute is undoubtedly a very huge factor in shaping relations. So that's why, because of that context, the tendency of many writers is to conflate. Now, of course, no, articles are not the same. The nature of articles are varied, right? One can be an opinion piece, one can be just business reporting, and one, so on and so forth. So that's why we also need to be sensitive to that. No? It's quite uneven, but without a doubt, the maritime dispute is really the main factor that affects perceptions. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't have issues with other partners, right? We do, except that based on the perceptions, if it's an issue like the maritime issue, there's an existential threat thing going on in people's minds. So that's why the reaction is like that, no? But as you know, with any partner, we've also had our own share of issues. Diba? We've had historical issues, like for Japan, we've had of course the war, and then after that, diba, you have comfort women, you have issues on JPEPA. We will have issues with any partner. Okay, that is the point. It's just that our situation right now, the existence of a dispute, the maritime dispute, that often affects, no, how things are reported and said. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Tina, maybe you can just see if you want to comment on this, no? From Dr. Mahar Mangahas, also fellow UPSEAN, and the founder of SWS. Are the Chinese people aware of the 2016 ruling of the UNCLOS Arbitral Tribunal that the 9-dash line has no historical basis?
Okay. This is, well, thank you, Professor Mangahas, for this question. I think it's more rhetorical than not. It's more of a comment, right? Well, it would be interesting to have this is out of scope, not on my paper, but since it was mentioned, right? It would be interesting if there's a poll on this, right? That's all I can say. It's really out of the scope of my paper. But yeah, whether or not maybe the question is, do they know it? So yeah, there are two questions, right? One, if they know about it or if they believe it. So it's knowledge and belief. So that's, I'd be interested in a survey that looks at that. Yeah. Sorry, I'm not competent to answer this one.
Okay. Perhaps in the first 6 years of the Aquino administration, there was almost no relationship, between China and the Philippines. Thus, there were no feasibility studies done, hardly any investment, certainly no grant or aid given by
Right.
China. And then in the case of Japan, especially with JICA, the Japanese Investment Cooperation Agency, it has been funding researches and feasibility studies every year
Right.
for the past 50 years. And thus, most projects, once they have undergone years of feasibility study, are already ready for bidding, awarding, and construction. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, taking off from what President Jeffrey was saying. Yeah, it's that. It's also the nature of their respective aid and investment regimes. One has a longer history, right? And one is emerging. So what's interesting what's interesting in the academic discourse is this study that I found where it says that, so China's regimes are evolving, right? But it's a curious observation that what they're doing now is actually very similar to what Japan used to do when it started their own regimes, aid and investment regimes. So meaning there's a process that's ongoing, right? There's a process that's ongoing, and like I mentioned in passing earlier, I think this is important, no, because there are studies that talk about, how many indicators, whether it's investment, employment growth, total factor productivity, how these indicators are positively affected by Chinese FDI. Okay, but the problem is that the actual experience may be different. So I think the question that needs to be asked is why? What conditions are prevailing? See, the studies show that China uses flexible approaches depending on the constraints in the partner country. Right? So I guess my point is that it takes two to tango. Looking at them, how they can be more responsible stakeholders and more active partners, but we also need to look at us, right? No, on one hand, you have real constraints that are domestic and institutional in nature, right? On the other hand, you have fit and appropriateness, which Montes pointed out. So there are just so many things. But yeah, I think we have to look at it from both sides. It takes two to tango. Okay. Sorry, I said too much. Too long an answer.
Do you think the sudden China pivot of President Duterte in 2016 caused such irrational high expectations of the Filipino people in expecting too much investments and benefits from his China pivot, such that people are bound to be disappointed by the slowness in the flow of Chinese aid, grants, and investments in the past several years?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Certainly, that's a factor, right? That's a factor because in the reports that we looked at, that was emphasized actually, that expectations were set a certain way, only to find that these agreements were far from being actualized. Ganon. But on the other hand, like I've had similar critiques towards our economic partnership with ASEAN, but that's not the talk that people wanted. Right? I mean, it's like my critique here also applies to others. Like in my previous studies, ganon, no? Whether it's the ASEAN Economic Community, whether it's APEC, whether whatever arrangement there is, it always goes back to that question. Not taking off from expectations, knowing that we already have quite a contentious narrative, that actually doesn't help, right? But on the other hand, it also doesn't help when we say that, oh, we have no issues. That tends to inflame the narrative more. So we really need to be a little bit more rational and sober, because it's not about pitting one partner with another. We need to go with complementarity. Even Japan sees China in terms of complementarity. Of course, the reality is there's a strategic rivalry going on in the region, right? China is coming in so strong, and Japan needs to reorient its own approach. No? And one way that it's doing that is through the PQI, the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, right? To distinguish. No? So it just tells you that that's the reality in the larger geoeconomic picture. No? So, but in actuality, Japan is really going towards complementarity with China. I mean, the region needs all the help it can get, and that also applies to the Philippines, diba? So it's really not about, okay, let's pit one against the other and all that. Thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned this strategic rivalry between China and Japan. No? After the president's visit to China in 2016, where he announced something like $9 billion or $15 billion in direct investments, and then $9 billion in ODA and grant. No? And a few months later, the Japanese Prime Minister matched or even exceeded China's promised investments and aid grants. And famously, Japanese Prime Minister Abe even went to have breakfast in President Duterte's home in Davao.
Right.
The Japanese has been doing a great job, I think, of winning over the hearts and minds of the Filipino people. Would you care to comment?
Yeah, good point. That's a very good point. Well, Japan had no choice but to do this, especially after the war. Right? It's a massive post-World War II reconstruction. That's a big factor here. That's why we've had, Chinese visitors, we've hosted them before. They would scratch their heads thinking that why are the issues with Japan not talked about here. And that's the easiest explanation, especially in Southeast Asia. The soft power was the main thing for Japan. So in fact, when you go to various conferences on Philippine studies, it's not a surprise to see a very large contingent of Japanese Filipinists. So there is that investment, the soft investments with people. Okay. So just to be clear, I'm not giving tips on how to on how to be friendly with it. It's really more of well, that's actually what happened. So in China's case, there's that observation that there was no similar investments, when it comes to people. In fact, whenever we would go to China for dialogues, we would meet our counterparts there. There would be practically no Filipinists. We're either grouped within Southeast Asia, the Southeast Asia like unit in the think tank, or American studies. Isn't that the funniest thing? Why are we grouped there? So what I'm saying, even intellectuals, even scholars who study the Philippines are not many in China. So I tried to point out just to affirm what President Jeff was saying. No, really the investments when it comes to people. I think that is a major factor. No? So even at the Asian Center, for instance, where I teach, the Japan program is so popular still, and a lot of those who take it really, take it for varied reasons, including pop culture. So it's there. Now those who take China are those that take the serious types who want to go into diplomacy. but but you see the divide. No? That's why you have generations of Filipino scholars who got their graduate degrees from Japan, right? And so China is still trying to improve this. Thank you.
Yeah, because it's quite surprising. It was only 70 years ago that the Philippines was actually invaded, and occupied by Japan for 3-4 years. Whereas in the case of China, China has never invaded the Philippines. But then now, due to this maritime dispute, many more Filipinos have such a negative attitude of China. What do you think of the Japanese moves, to diversify ODA aside from build infrastructure such as maritime security, agriculture, development projects, and disaster risk reduction projects? Do you think this is the way for China to follow, if it wants to win over the sentiments of the Filipino people?
Right. Certainly, that's a huge factor. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, um, Japan's involvement in various sectors give that impression that they're actually interested about. But that question is sort of tricky because we're talking about not just the Philippine interests here, right? So we have a partner because they also have their own interests to serve, right? So, I mean, rationally, we sort of cannot have that expectation, right? That we want this ideal situation with this partner, and we want all partners to have that with us. It's not that that's not how relations work. Diba? It's also contingent on what the other offers. But yeah, but when it comes to the narrative, that plays into it a lot, right? That plays into it a lot. So, what could actually be beneficial is, when it comes to the projects that China has with the Philippines, it could actually be explained more. Diba? Kasi our goal is not to spread economic partnership in different sectors with partners. Pero well, we want that, that's ideal, but that's not how relations work, diba? Pero I would like to get more information about the existing ones, right? How are they, you may have just one project, but we're talking about impact. So at the end of the day, it's not just about number, right? You're talking about appropriateness and impact. So remember what I was saying earlier about that study by Montes and Cruz, that in the past we've been getting FDI. Of course, we were lagging in the region, but nevertheless, we've had FDI. But how come it never really translated into the upgrading that we wanted? Well, much of it is in the institutional environment. I keep going back to that, right? It's like, this is usually the analogy that I use. You have a waterfall, right? A waterfall of aid and investment. Okay, so but the thing is, when the Philippines tries to catch it, we're only using a bottle. So it doesn't matter how, and the opening of the bottle is so small, right? So it doesn't matter that you have a big waterfall of aid and investment, but when we try to get it in, it's going to be very constrained because of that small thing. So it's incumbent upon us to really find out why? What's causing us to use a very small catch basin? In my example, it's the bottle, such that even if it comes in, the translation to actual outcomes leaves much room to be desired.
Okay. From Erwin Laya, from Davao, Lyceum of the Philippines University. In your opinion, how can the US and China peacefully coexist?
Okay. I think that's another webinar that we need to do. It's quite out of scope. But, well, yeah. To be honest, before Trump came in, before the Trump administration started, it was difficult. It was difficult to imagine, right? That that period of sanctions could happen. Why? Because we were thinking, okay, there's so much to lose. You really become inefficient if you trade sanctions, right? You both sides lose. No, you gain more if you cooperate. It's just that there's a political economy situation, going on. So our understanding is that while the last few years were very difficult, no, between the two, both sides will need to find a way to engage. Mahirap eh. It's one of those things because sure, they are strategic rivals. However, when it comes to economics, both will gain from cooperation. In ganon. So sorry, my answer is I'm not competent to answer that. It's not about my paper.
Yeah, there seemed to be a bipartisan consensus now in the US, no? Both Democrats and Republicans, especially now with Democratic President Biden, who, by all indications, going to continue the strategic competition with China. And despite protestations of economic losses by the US Chamber of Commerce, he will probably continue with the tariffs imposed on Chinese products and continue the ban on such Chinese companies like Huawei or WeChat. So it seems the US is willing to bite the economic bullet just to prevent China from gaining superiority, at least in Asia. Yeah, would you like to comment?
Well, okay. I think it's going to be a challenge for this administration, no? For the new Biden administration, because data will show you that it's really unproductive. So it's a matter of weighting, meaning putting weights, right? It's a matter of the actual weights or the actual salience that you impute, right? Do you weigh the other things more than the fact that soybean farmers will lose their farms in the US? No, is that more important, right? And yeah, and there's so many other things, no. Yeah, it poses a challenge for the world. It poses a challenge for the world because the tendency could be a reversion, right? And we don't want that. We're trying to be more efficient. We're trying to actualize gains from trade. And right now, all these sanctions regime negate the original objective, no, of why there is trade. Of course, it's not to say that trade is always, there are like no problems with trade. Of course, there are, and that's why we need to keep the conversation going. No, however, that's the situation there. It's very tricky for Biden to just take a step back because the perceptions actually matter. Diba? They're trying to sort of say that, no. So if he takes a step back, he could be branded as the same way that Trump was branded in association with Russia. Ganon. No? So it's very tricky because they're also managing domestic narratives. Ganon. But I still stand by what I said earlier, that it's really a losing proposition. Your only justification in pursuing it is that your calculation doesn't just involve the economics. Now you're thinking about ascendancy in the world. Diba? So same thing in the Myanmar issue right now. There's that pressure. How will you know how will Biden how will the Biden administration respond? And they responded no through sanctions. So, however, yun na nga, it just reflects the larger strategic rivalry that both are doing. No, pero when it comes to the economic parts, wala. The lobbies will still be there, no, because it's really a problem. You can, yeah. So sooner or later, perhaps when things die down, certain measures will be taken. But right now, they're really just responding to the domestic narrative that's going on. Thank you.
Okay, let's talk about the strategic rivalry between China and Japan and how it affects the Philippines. No? How do you think the Philippines can maximize the economic benefits by befriending closely both China and Japan?
Oh, okay. A host of ways, no. So as my presentation earlier showed, many projects are already ongoing, no, with Japan. In terms of dispersion, in terms of having involvement across sectors, you see that already. So in that sense, China has to wrap up on that. But the question is, how do we maximize, right? So in this sense, I'll just keep reiterating what I said before. The first thing we need to do is to look at capacity, right? I mean, we cannot just get into an agreement and then bahala na si Batman after we sign it, right? So it's quite frustrating when you see it because the Philippines is like first honor in signing agreements with everyone, no, not just China and Japan, with everybody. But how it was able to manage, the realization of these agreements, that's another thing. Now that's another question. Yeah, so that's my first answer. Okay, the capacity, which cuts across institutional health, transactions cost, the economic environment, and all that. Second is we need to be clear about our interests, right? So that we need not go into projects that have very little utility. No? So, halimbawa, if you look at the government documents, diba, implementation issues are enumerated. It's so sanitized, you won't be able to see what the actual stories are. So, nakalista lang doon, ano? No, so I was very curious about this one mention, about China's implementation issue because it mentioned the Beyond the Bridge hula baloo. No? But in the government document, syempre won't say that. Just says that this, right? And in the other projects, like projects with other countries, usually nakalagay lang doon, okay, waiting for EIC, Environmental Impact Assessment, EIA, Environment Impact Assessment, right? Okay, so yun lang. So you won't see really the story. But that caught my eye because we know that in the public conversation, that was a huge thing. Right? So in the first place, the projects really need to go through due diligence. It doesn't hurt to actually explain that to the public, to see where we are. Kasi nga, speculation doesn't help. Right? Because if we don't have information, guess what other information will fill people's minds. Right? So if you say, okay, that bridge is so important, but other people are not convinced and it's not, and there's no answer to that, then that that one incident creates the impression that all projects are like that, that it's nothing. So even you say no, it was not alone, it was a grant thing, but still, right? So it's that. So one is institutional capacity and institutional health, our ability to actually absorb, right? Second is appropriateness and fit. Where do those projects, or how do those projects actually map out to our interests? When you look at one of the DTI documents, everything is there already. You have all the industries and subsectors under each listed, no, in terms of backward and forward linkages. Diba? So when it comes to priorities, it's already there. Eh. All we really need to do is to do it. Right? So I'm amazed because it's already there. We actually know, we actually have that we actually have that as a guide. Balik doon, no? We say that this business has a very strong backward and forward linkages. So usually sectors in agriculture have that, diba? But there's a certain thing, like let's say BPOs, medyo mahina ang linkages. Right? So ibig sabihin, if it prospers, wala masyadong epekto, no, sa mga nakakapalibot na mga sectors or industriya sa kanya. Samantalang kapag agrikultura, kapag nagpasok ka dyan ng resources, malaki ang impact, no, sa mga nakakonekta sa kanya. So wait, what is my point here? Am I digressing? I'm actually not digressing. What I'm trying to say is that in terms of appropriateness and fit, we need to lessen incidents where that is questioned. So to do that, right, more diligence is required in actually making sure that the project is beyond reproach. No? Kasi otherwise, sayang eh. You will, all that energy lost in trading barbs about a project that was not appropriate in the first place. No, but this applies again to all partners. Diba? We should do that to all. So institutions, appropriateness and fit, and then third would be, I guess, better information for all. No, so yeah, I think those three things. If we do well in that, we'd improve how we maximize the economic cooperation with both countries.
Do you think media itself, no, has contributed a lot on Filipinos' impressions of foreign aid and grant of China and Japan to the Philippines?
Yes.
It's media itself that is probably biased negatively against China and prone to think positively of Japanese aid and investment.
Okay. Okay. So what I will say is that the presidents, no, the events that happened prior, no, because there's so many unresolved issues connected to those events, no, you'd see that a lot in the reports. So even if you're talking about project details, you just suddenly find a reference to the dispute. So project details are actually not connected, right, to this, but you always find that association, right? And why is that? Because there is this underlying context. So to your question, how much of it is a factor? It's a very big factor, right? But I'd be cautious in saying that media is biased. I'd rather be constructivist, no, in answering that, in the sense that how are perceptions constructed in the first place, right? So it's perception construction, how we sort of, yeah. So if that is the only kind of information that is why, you know, for researchers it can be very frustrating, right? Because I want to look at it objectively, but you have all these things swirling around, and then you have social media as well, no, with mainstream media, and so things tend to get convoluted. So I think there is a huge room for researchers to contribute here, right? You could offer, we could offer more objective analyses in trying to look at this. But otherwise, it's just this or the other, right? This or the other. One is bad, one is good. We cannot. That's too simplistic, right? But yeah, short answer to your question. Yeah, media is a force, no. But rather than saying simply that it's biased, we need to ask why those images are actually constructed in the first place. Diba? Kasi nga, diba? So yeah, so mahirap eh. I would not be fair if I just said it that way, right? If I just said that, it's just nothing but bias. There are positions, no? What I will say is that there are positions, and those positions reflect certain information sets. Okay, I do sound like a very boring academic here, but that's how I'll frame it, right? There are certain positions, and we may not agree with all those positions, right? But each position is always contingent on in the information set that a person has, right? So the question is, why is that information set like that? And what can we do to improve it? That's why all my interventions are more long term, no? In nature, right? If we find if we encounter comments like the Lunar New Year comment, I don't know if you saw that in social media.
Yes.
You did.
Yeah, I've
I
seen
mean,
that. Yeah.
it's so funny. It's so senseless, right? But I'm thinking, okay, that really is a problem when people in the academe or people who go to education uh, at this day and age say that, no? Because it makes me wonder, what is it in education that's not able to mediate, right? It's not able to sort of provide better understanding of the situation. Yung ganun, ano? So that's why I keep looking at the deeper determinants, right? I'm not in any place to scold the media for reporting a certain way. But since I'm interested in institutional development, the question that I will ask is, how do we reconfigure those information sets? Right? Is it education? Is it better information that we need access to in order to process? Is it democratizing economic information? I mean, it's too much to unpack, right? Too much to unpack, really. Kasi just looking at the difference between approved investment and foreign direct investment, hilo ka na eh. Diba? Parang, aren't they both investments? Yeah, but so when you see approved investments reported in a press con or reported in a broadsheet, you'd say, okay, so our problems are solved. All these resources are coming in. Oh yeah, but that's just approved. We don't know yet how they will be realized. Diba? So maybe so there is a hole in reportage. No? So it's a disconnect that we need to deal with. Because the bigger picture is not being communicated, right? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I certainly agree with you that China has been getting a lot of bad press, no? Especially in the Philippines. Like in the case of the Binondo Intramuros Bridge, it was already a grant, no? Free by China, and it's getting a lot of flack because of it. Do you think China should be more choosy in selecting projects to give us grant or even give aid to, no? Or even as loans? Because like as you mentioned, in the case of the Kaliwa Dam, again, China is being criticized for a much bigger dam, and that is environmentally destructive as compared to the Japanese proposed one.
So yes, sorry, Jeff, I missed the question.
Yeah, the question is, should China be more
Selective.
choosy?
Okay.
Yeah, in choosing projects suggested by the
Right,
Philippine government.
Right.
No,
I get it. Right.
otherwise it will be getting
The flack. Right.
of even donating such
Right.
bridges. It's always getting the shorter end of the stick. No.
Yep. Okay. The thing is, the approaches of partners are different, right? Like I said before, what China's doing now is very similar to what Japan used to do when it started, right? And there are
That's
also
after the war,
yes,
after the war, the
right?
50s or 60s.
So matagal na yun. But the point is that they evolve, right? And they're still evolving. I mean, Japan has no choice but to evolve because China is such a force today. But okay. Studies show that China is already moving towards places with better regulation, meaning places with more regulatory muscle. So ibig sabihin nag-iiba na. No? Ang magiging tanong na lang is that why do they still do the same things projects today in certain countries today. I look at it from the point of view of incentives in the environment. Okay, it's not to absolve, no, it's not to take away the responsibility, no, the expectation that all our partners need to be responsible. Syempre, we want them to be responsible, but economic actors respond to incentives. That's the thing, diba? So if you send a proposal and that proposal looks good and you're the one who actually sent it, but from the current approach of China, it's not going to interfere, right? Kasi due diligence, that makes it also, that can also be tricky kasi lalong tatagal, di ba? There are just those things, no? But China is also evolving towards projects with better monitoring and all that, no? Because it is concerned. So I think that will help. But I don't want to preempt because I also want to see how they will evolve in the next few years in response to this. Because of course, both countries are cognizant of each other's approaches, right? Japan is not trying to supplant China in any way. That's not very fruitful. They know that. That's not a very fruitful approach. No? But what it's trying to do is to influence partners to look at them more favorably. Ganun kasi that's the way, because they have to distinguish themselves as PQ, partnership for quality, partner for quality. No, so yun so it's doing that. Now this can help China if it becomes more selective in the future, but it depends. Because there are going to be adjustments when it comes to conceptual approach, right? Kasi, di ba, non-interference, you don't want to interfere with the proposing country's plans, di ba? Yun ganon. Yun nga lang, yun. So these articles, the articles that talk about that, no, they compare projects, sometimes comparing apples to oranges. They have a purpose. It's a watchdog sort of a purpose, right? They have to see, whether things are that. So when those articles come up, for me as an academic, I don't think of the comparison country. When I read an article like that, I immediately think, why? What did we do wrong? Because we were the ones who proposed, right? When you agree, again, it's two to tango. So what did you agree to, or what did you propose? Yun, So yun. But yeah, the short answer to your question is yes, it can work. Because it projects that image that, okay, we're also trying to be a more responsible stakeholder here. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may add, we have a comment from Kenneth Benedicto. It seems China needs to understand the cultural differences between China and the Philippines. It appears China is rubbing us the wrong way.
Yep.
One example is the Intramuros Binondo Bridge. No? Parang yung China, kumakapa pa. No? Unlike yung the Japanese, they've been doing this for the past 70 years.
Right.
No? And China, as late as 30 years ago, was still a poor country. No?
Right.
It was the one who needed aid and grant and investments from Western countries.
Right.
And it's only the past 10, 15, 20 years that China started becoming rich and granting aid and doing investments in other countries. More so in the Philippines, only in the past 4 or 5 years, under this Duterte administration.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Kenneth. That's a very good question. In the literature that I analyzed, there's actually a study on cultural risk. So it's called cultural risk. No, so it basically argues that there's unobserved better economic relationship when the cultural risk is low. So what mediates cultural risk? You have cultural heritage, heritage. You have religion, language, and legal structures. Diba? So that's why you will notice that for many countries, um, their largest partners are those, I mean, in history, no, are those that they share close proximity with when it comes to those factors. Okay, so it's not everything, no? Kasi syempre when you have big countries with a lot to trade, with many things to trade and to invest, um, they become partners regardless of the culture. But that's an observation. That's a very real thing, no? The cultural risk aspect. Now that because there's a certain kind of understanding that's implicit already because it's in the culture, then you're able to sort of shake off the cobwebs, the noise, the white noise. Diba? So yeah, so I guess more people to people relations, ganon. I one time I was in. Let me share with you an anecdote. Sorry, this is a little bit trivial, but
Sure,
I
go
think
ahead.
it's
Go ahead. Go
related.
ahead.
I remember in one of our trips, no, it was Professor Bavera, Eileen Bavera, who actually organized the trip. So we went to China. So that was Eileen, myself, and some colleagues from UP. And so we were hosted by this Chinese group, no, and there was a point in that trip when one of the hosts sort of pulled me aside to ask a question, saying that no, because they were with us the whole time, like during the official dialogues, but also during when we would go out to eat. Kasi that's the thing, yun yung trabaho ng host, no? They bring us around. And remember, while being together, they observed a few things. And so he pulled me aside and asked me this question. So he said, "Are you all longtime friends, like you and the other Filipinos who came here?" I said, "No, we just actually we just met." Oh, but why is it that you're always like laughing together and all that? So I had to explain that it may be a cultural trait. We we can get along with people fast, but if a sensitive issue is touched, we can just sue them. You know what I'm saying? It's like me and my relative, yun ganon. So I was saying that it's like that, no? You drink and sing together in videoke. And then, di ba, mapalitan lang, some other person doesn't like the song My Way, di ba, magsasaksakan na yan. So there's just certain things in our psyche um, that are like that. No, it's not that we're laughing together a lot. It's not because we're all childhood friends. Of course not. But that's a particular trait there. So when you have that, it's so easy to get along. And it's just like that, right? And so that moment actually, made me reflect. No? Oo nga, no? Because in studies, this is actually looked at. We don't study it much here, but in other places they study it a lot. No? Like for instance, no, like another colleague of mine from an international network studied something like he called it Buddhist IR. What is that? Oh, because I'm not trained in international relations, I wondered what that was. So what is Buddhist IR? It's international relations among Buddhist countries. So the main premise is that there's a certain level of understanding that's implicit. That's implicit. So that's why there's just so many things you don't have to spell it out. So even when you're disputing something, right? That level of understanding plays a role in mediating responses. Okay, you know what I'm saying? I don't know if I
Yeah.
made sense.
Yeah. We get what you mean. No? From Herman Laurel, China naturally comes from a very disadvantaged position at the start, but over the past 10 years, and especially during the Duterte term, there has been a gradually and steady improvement in the understanding of Chinese intention for the region and the world, and improvement of its image. But there's still some way to go.
Yeah.
And
So
also, from Ken Benedicto, China appears to be trying hard to please the Philippines, but always ends up on the wrong side.
yeah. Yeah, because understanding doesn't, it's not an automatic thing, right? You It's something that you work on. Especially when the starting position involves non-proximate, no, so lack of proximity in certain things, diba? Like ganun talaga eh. It's not gonna be, it takes years to do that. That's why our discussion earlier, so much cultural understanding comes from long-standing relations, right? I mean, long-standing history of relating with each other in many different ways. Yung ganoon, no? That's why in another trip, I remember, I think this was a trip in Germany before, and there were so many Latinos in the group. And then for some reason, we don't understand why we click. It's like, and I was the only Filipino there, so they adopted me. I'm like, why do we click? It's without even saying anything or explaining anything. There's a certain kind of understanding that's there. So in the case of China, because we share a different context, we also have a very long-standing historical relationship, right? It predates state relations. Diba? So our historians in Pax and Kaisa always talk about this in their public lectures, no? And so yun nga, but we really need to work on it. So I do agree with the comments. It's been improving, it's gradual, but yeah, needs more improvement. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. We run out of questions from the audience. Thank you, Dr. Tina. And now we would like to request our Executive Vice President, Mr. Ray Roquero, to give the closing remarks. Raven, can you unmute EVP Ray Roquero?
Thank you. Okay na.
Okay na, okay na.
Thank you, Mr. President. On behalf of the Apcu officers and members, we express our sincerest and profoundest gratitude to Dr. Tina Clemente of the University of the Philippines Asian Center as our very eloquent and authoritative speaker on the topic comparing perceptions and empirics, China-Japan aid and investments in the Philippines. It was a highly enlightening Zoom conference, listening and interacting with Dr. Clemente, whose expertise and knowledge on aid and investments by both China and Japan in the Philippines provided us with a brighter perspective and informed assessment as to the significant roles being played by these top two official development assistance partners of our country. We would like also to thank all those who participated in this lively webinar to know more on the nature of ODAs, grants, and loans. And finally, let me again personally thank Dr. Clemente, and we hope that we will have you again as our resource speaker in the near future, maybe on another topic. Maraming salamat po para sa lahat.
Thank you, EVP Ray. Thank you, Dr. Tina. Before we close, we would like to proudly announce that Apcu, together with the Chinese Embassy, will be organizing the first Manila Forum on Philippine-China relations. And we will have as speaker no less than the President of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, President Xin Li-Chin. He is a very well-known and respected economist in China and around the world. So he will be our speaker on March 3, Wednesday, 3 p.m. And we will also have our own Apcu Chairman Emeritus, President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, to give the welcoming message, and Chinese Ambassador Huang Xilian to do the opening remarks. So again, ladies and gentlemen, I hope to see everyone for this important forum by Apcu on March 3, Wednesday. That is around 2 weeks from now. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you to our speaker, Dr. Tina Clemente. Thank you everyone. Have
Thank
a
you.
nice day.
Thank you.
Have a
Thank you.
great day ahead. Thank you everyone. See you on March 3.
Thank you, Dr. Tina Clemente. It was very informative.
Thank you.